Good evening, and for those of you who are visiting with us this evening from the outside world, welcome to our first SCI-Arc Design Forum. We're very excited about our first speaker. He's someone who lives in the area. He's participated in other Design Forum evenings, and we're honored to have him as our speaker tonight. I want to give you a little bit of his background because I think it's always interesting to see where a person comes from and what some of the experiences have been that have shaped his design philosophy and the work that he's done. Roland Coate is the son of an architect. He was a very famous architect. He worked for a while in his father's office. He said he was the model maker. And before he went off to school, he went to Occidental College here in town. He was born in Pasadena. And then he went east to attend Cornell, where he completed his studies in architecture. He spent some time in the service, being sent to Europe, where he spent some time in Paris, which proved to be a nice experience for him. As he described, he was able to spend some happy times sketching, developing some of his sketching techniques. And when he came back, he went to work in New York, and he worked in two very interesting offices. The office of I.M. Pei, where he worked on one of the first poured-in-place concrete apartment buildings that Pei did in New York City. And then he also worked in the office of Marcel Breuer, where he also worked on some concrete work. One of the projects he worked on with Breuer was St. John's Abbey, which I believe is in Minneapolis. When he became licensed, his licensing was in the city of New York. And when he came to California, he worked in the office of Bob Alexander. This was about 1962. And one of the main projects that he worked on was, he was the project architect on the master plan of the University of California at San Diego, and he did some design work down there. In 1963, he opened his own office in downtown Los Angeles. He said it was right next to Pershing Square, which is really downtown. And he worked there for a while. Then he moved to Pasadena, where he did some work on the Caltech campus. And then he moved to Brentwood, and then to Venice, where his office now is located. He's done some very interesting work, a rather diversified practice from small to medium scale. We're delighted to have Roland Coate with us tonight to share some of his ideas and some of his fine work.
It's really a fantastic pleasure for me to be here tonight. This is something that I've looked forward to for a long time. I've been to quite a few of these Wednesday night sessions and listened to a lot of architects explaining their work. And I've been keenly interested in the school. I think it's the really exciting thing that's happening in architecture in this area, without any question about it in my mind. I like the feeling of the place. I like the work that I see being done here, and I like the general spirit that's taking place. It's very much the size that Cornell was when I was going to school there, and I get the same kind of feeling from this area that we had in the drafting rooms there, and it's very, very nice to see after some of the huge campuses with some of the really big schools and so on. I wanted to start out tonight by explaining what this program is going to be. I'm going to show some slides and run through a number of different projects, some of them to a certain degree of detail and some of them very briefly, which I hope you will excuse. And that's, I know, a little bit dangerous when you're talking to students, because students have a way of really wanting to bore right in on the crux of a problem, and I may not get to it in certain cases here. But we have at the end of the program a 27-minute film that was made by one of my clients who is a professional photographer of the construction of his house. And I wasn't sure until just about 3 hours ago that we were going to be able to have the film, but we do have it now, so that'll be coming at the end. Before I start on the slides, I wanted to just touch a little bit on some of my personal philosophies in architecture. In this program, there are going to be 3 other architects, and I suppose intermingled you'll have other people coming in, but you'll have Pele and Gary and the fellow from Cuddle, Roland and Scott, Paul Kenneth. And there'll be, I think, very different kinds of people than I am, essentially. The last time I heard Pele talking about his work, he described himself as being at the cutting edge of architecture. I don't really consider myself to be at the cutting edge of architecture. I would like to present myself tonight as being essentially a fine artist involved in architecture, much more than a planner, or even, as horrible as it may sound, even a problem solver. I approach architecture very definitely from the standpoint of dealing with a complex kind of a sculpture. And I have consciously tried to limit the projects that I've undertaken to ones that were small enough so that I could grapple with them on the basis that a sculptor would deal with a piece of work that he was doing in his studio. I've always worked with very small groups. I think one of the largest groups I ever had was when Tom Main and Jim Stafford were in the office, and I think there were 3 other people, and that was about as large as the firm ever got. The last 3 years or so, I've been working almost entirely by myself, or maybe with 1 draftsman. And the last man that I had was Mike Russell, who some of you may know. He's now at the Ames office, and since he's gone, not that I didn't love him, because he was great, but it feels so fantastic to be working alone that I don't know how I would ever be able to start back up again. And that's part of the evolution that I think it's important that I express, because it's been an evolution in my own mind from thoughts that I had about where I wanted to go, which was to have some kind of a organization, down to where I am mentally today, which is really wanting to spend a great deal of time on each individual thing that I do by myself as a craftsman. And when I say this, I don't mean that when I say that I think of architecture as sculpture, for example, I don't mean it in a very limited sense of its being an abstract physical thing. I mean accepting the totality of the program and the structure and all the multitude of different things that one's dealing with in a building, but still considering it to be essentially a work of art. And my endeavor really is to try and create spaces that people will really be moved to be in. In other words, if you walk into a space and you say, wow, this is something that I'm never going to forget, well, that's really the object, it seems to me, of what I'm trying to do in architecture. So with that, I think we can start. Does that come on? No, that's okay. No, that's okay. I was just going to move around and point to some things, but I can do it this way. This first little project is one of the most recent things that I've worked on. On the left-hand side, the blue stripes indicate the Venice canals, and the little red rectangle indicates a 30-foot wide by 90-some foot long typical lot in this environment, which I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with. The idea here started from the concept of designing an artist's studio. And we developed this packing box model building technology, which I thought was very nice. We built this model in one night, and this end of it is on the right is the end that faces the Grand Canal. The other end faces an alleyway called, I think it's called Gran Corso. The materials involved were wood studs and stucco, and the idea was to create an interior space which would be as flexible as possible. In plan, starting on the ground floor, simply a garage that could be used for a variety of purposes, an entry area, a living area, a kitchen, as you can see, and redundant stairways, 2 stairways going to the upper levels. The reason for doing this was that I felt very strongly that this little box should have the capability of being divided at each end into separate functions, whatever those might be. And I was thinking in quite abstract terms here, so that I wasn't really concerned with whether this was going to be a painter or a sculptor or even maybe an attorney, but fundamentally and what would happen in working back and forth between the front and back of this very narrow building. I also thought very carefully about what the meaning of this kind of a box would be in that environment. What were we saying to the community? And that was one of the most important things that I think we went through was this box, which was going to, for all practical purposes, to be a very strong kind of a statement, very strong, simple kind of a statement, going to be something that would really help the Venice Canal area scale-wise and in terms of its aesthetics, or was it going to be something that would be a detriment to the community? And I mean that in the best sense of the word. And fundamentally, we decided that this very simple box, and when I say we, I mean the clients and I, felt that this very simple box would be much more meaningful than a more flamboyant kind of a design, that we would be giving more to the community with this kind of simplicity. As you go upstairs, you can see you come to a study and a bedroom at the back. All the plumbing is stacked and that kind of thing. And then third level plan breaks out into a roof terrace, and then going on up again, another roof terrace. And the idea was just simply to use all the surfaces and make it really, as I say, as flexible as possible with the skylight that you can see on the third level plan there, letting a lot of light down into this living area. And these are very, very simple elevations. There is a change there from that front elevation and the model on this particular drawing. The glass goes all the way down. We weren't quite sure whether that would be desirable or not. The history of this project was that it went through the building department with flying colors. It went through the Coastal Commission with flying colors. And then the citizens of the Venice Canal area had a meeting, and they decided they didn't want this building. And they invited my clients to the meeting, and they scared them so bad that they dropped the project. And that's the main reason that I'm showing this project to you tonight, because I think that that's such an interesting evolution, and it really surprised me. It was really kind of a shock to me to discover that the building that we had worked on so hard was not wanted by the people that were living there. And then I did a lot of thinking about it, and after a while I sort of began agreeing with them that maybe it wasn't such a great idea, and that's where it stands today. That's a section and another shot of the model with the side opened up so that you can see what's happening inside there. Now, moving on to another project, and this is one that we're going to look at in a little bit more depth, and this is the one that the film is going to be about later on. This is the project in Montecito, south of Santa Barbara. I spent quite a bit of time with the clients looking for this site, and when we found it, it's a ridge about a mile and a half back from the ocean with fantastic views. We automatically had a number of givens in the program. One of them, and one of the most important ones to us, was that this was an extremely high fire hazard area. Another one was that it got very heavy rains and winds and had a tendency to really be like, it was a very exposed site. So the solution that eventually developed was one of using poured-in-place concrete and steel mullions and glass, and in other words, making all of the exterior materials as fireproof as possible. You enter the house by approaching the driveway, which you can see in both of these, the site plan and the aerial, and you arrive at the parking area, which is where the stack is there and the 4 little air-cooled condensers for the air conditioning system. To enter the house, you actually walk on to roof elevation. You are at roof elevation when you arrive. You go down into the courtyard, and then you go inside the house, and the reasons for the different angles of the design are that each of the rooms in the house is oriented toward a precise and particular view. The garage is to the rear on the upper side of that embankment, and the guest quarters, two bedrooms, or bedroom and a living room and a kitchen, are over on the south side. The tower is basically an integral part of the program in that it is a place to go and contemplate the view, do yoga exercises, have quiet conversations, that type of thing. The chimneys are fireplaces, the 2 in front. The one at the rear is the exhaust from the mechanical system, so you actually see exposed from the air-cooled condensers into a basement mechanical equipment room and then back out to that stack, the whole cycle of the heating and cooling of the house. Again, this is essentially what you saw before. This is the roof plan, of course, and showing the guest area and garage back at the back. And the floor plan then, as you go down into the central courtyard, you are able to look through the house and out to the view, and you arrive at a hallway situation, then down into that large space, which is the living room, turning to your right, the dining area and the food preparation areas and maid's room, and going over to the left side of the house, so that essentially we really have an old-fashioned Breuer binuclear sort of a plan. The bedroom area, dressing area, and he is a photographer, as I say, he made this film, so that where the very narrow stairway is there toward the back of the house, that is going from his study down into a 2-story screening room. And then I think we get that, yeah. Then we're down in the 2-story screening room and then into his dark room area, and then another bedroom for the child. And on the left, the west elevation, which is the one that faces the view. And then in section, a transverse section going through the screening room, the sunken terrace, and the kitchen on the left. And then this section going through from the swimming pool up a double flight of stairs. At that first landing, you come this way and you wind up in the master bedroom. And then continue on up, you wind up at the roof level and then up into the tower. And then another section through the courtyard and then through the living room of the house. So that you see the two major spaces being the living room, which is a relatively low ceilinged space. That ceiling is about 13 feet high. And then the screening room, where the ceiling is actually quite a bit higher than the room is wide, providing you with two rather interesting kinds of spaces. And then again, the north elevation, which is the one where you see the least of the house, where it really fits back into the site as earth architecture, and then the south elevation, which is essentially just an expression of the fact that there are some dressing rooms and a dark room. There, as you move around the house, you sort of feel a dichotomy, at least I do, in that part of it is sort of designed purely as a matter of function, and then part of it is relatively highly controlled. And that's kind of an interesting feature, I feel. Yeah, this is coming up the driveway, and that's sort of the first thing you see. And then this is actually, the first thing you see is from the road down below, looking up, and then coming up around the curving driveway, then you begin to see the concrete and the steel, industrial steel sash, which is kind of purposely going back into something that Nitra used, only doing it at a much larger scale, with huge pieces of fixed glass, 7/8 inch thick plate glass. And then on up around, this is now grown up, and obviously the idea is that the site just flows up over. The concrete was simply poured in place, and we, instead of expressing form tie holes or anything of that kind, we just patched them and put a coat of silicone sealer on everything. So here you are arriving up at the parking area. And then you get some idea of the scale of this tower, and then looking back behind you toward the guest area, which gets its own special views. And this is all like supposed to be very surrealistic, and I think it does what it's supposed to do. And then you go out onto the roof, and you begin to get the views. That wasn't too nice a day. And then down that double flight of stairs and the door that goes into the master bedroom there. And then entering, you go through the sunken courtyard, and then this is looking back at the area which encloses some of the mechanical equipment, and then there is a shaft that goes down, and the rest of it is down on a level below this. And then looking from the central courtyard through the house in the way that I mentioned earlier, which is one of the nice things. And then inside the house, then several views of the living area and looking out through these huge sheets of plate glass. The floors are simply waxed concrete. This is the master bedroom and the dining room, the two of the flanges that come off, and you can see the different kinds of views that you get. The table we had made out of Cold Spring granite and shipped out from Minnesota. It was an interesting thing. And then this is the narrow stairway that I described that goes from the screening room up to the study. That's only about 30 inches wide. It's really a very medieval kind of an experience. And then the screening room, which I don't have a wide enough angle, really, lens to photograph properly. And then the study at the top of that narrow flight of stairs. Billy Sanders' lovely chair that he designed for that place. And then a typical bathroom. And we just let the wood countertops run through essentially everywhere. Another bathroom, and then a view from a front terrace looking at that. I wanted to show you that steel sash that has a kind of a very dark nylon, sprayed on and baked nylon finish on it. And then the kind of a library area at the back of the living room and the kitchen area. And then some exterior views. And the pool equipment room, which is sort of a round bunker. And then the house under construction which that shot really interested me because it sort of was the house going through its Monterey period, which is what my father used to be involved with. And then more construction shots. We used steel freeway column forms for the chimneys, and typical wood forms for the side walls. We used plastic coated plywood. I'll skip over this because it's going to be pretty carefully shown in the film. A house like this, I mean, as I'm sure you're all aware, evolves through a lot of really exciting sculptural things that disappear. You know, one set of things happens and then something else is poured, and it never is there again. So it's really fun for me to go back and look at these early photographs. Moving to another project now, this is going back to about 1965 in Mazatlán, Mexico. And this is a hotel that operates kind of like a private club. It has all the facilities that a normal hotel would have, but it operates like a private club. Our program here was essentially dealing with wind and sun and very tropical climate, and I decided to try and solve the problems by providing as many alternate spaces as I possibly could. And remember now, this is 1965. The last project I showed you was designed in 1973. So there's a big time span between these two. I took a trip around Mexico, and I was really enthralled by public squares of varying scales, and I was convinced that the way to design this little project was to come up with some really nice exterior spaces, some of them which would be on the ocean side, and some of them would be interior spaces, and some of them would be covered spaces outside, and some of them would be uncovered spaces outside. And if you provided enough different kinds of spaces, there would be a place to go at any particular time of the day or night that would be comfortable for you to eat or sit out or have a drink or whatever. So that's the way the design evolved. The room type simply broke down into suites, which have a sitting room, a bedroom, and a bath, and studios, which have just a bedroom and a bath. And I think you can pick them out on the site plan there. The rest of it was bars, lobbies, dining rooms, and that kind of thing. The scale we're talking about here, I think the whole project covers about 4 acres. And I think you can see this section is fairly self-explanatory. Under construction, we're dropping back in time, back to mud brick and rough stone. And this was a real pleasure for me to be able to deal with a local technology. And wherever possible, we used local materials. We used materials that were made right in Mazatlán, and we didn't even go out and get, you know, great tiles from Puebla or whatever. We just stuck within the local technology, and it really worked quite beautifully. The whole plan was laid out on a modular metric system so that the maestros simply had to lay it out with strings. And we did the working drawings up here, and then I had an associate architect down there who actually was the general contractor, as is the tradition in Mexico. And we had a very delightful relationship. You can see the way the building is built, obviously, with the concrete, with the brick columns, which are 60 meters square, forming the formwork for a steel mesh and concrete, which is poured down in, and placed down in, and then grout poured down in, and then laying out a rather primitive kind of a scaffolding, and laying concrete, lightweight concrete block made locally on top of that, spaced out so that steel could be run both ways in between that, and then again concrete being poured, so that you essentially had a very primitive kind of a two-way slab system when you remove the scaffolding. And the varieties of stonework were just really fantastic. I mean, you could get anything you wanted, from very rough to very finished, and it was just really a pleasure to watch these people work. And things like swimming pools. I mean, the whole swimming pool was was finished with mosaic tile, that type of thing. And the patterns of bricks that one could get into. And so this is kind of the finished project in its early days. The vegetation has grown up tremendously since this time. The pyramids worked out, I think, especially well, and the view from the roof of those really influenced me a lot when I started later working on the house that I just showed you. Everything is on the metric module, and you can see it reflected in the brick of the paving and in the modular column spacing. It all lays out into single or double spacings. I felt really very good about working on this project because I sort of have a sneaking suspicion that this is where architects can really do, I mean, I have a feeling that this is the way architects from the United States ought to work in foreign technologies. They ought to work within the existing technologies rather than importing our technology to the foreign country. And I think this, for example, these people had really forgotten how to make arches. And we showed them how to build a scaffolding, and it was all very simple and so on. And you go down there now and you'll find arches upside down, sideways, you know, coming out of your ear. And I'm working on another little project down there in the same area, and I was going to use big barrel vaults, and I went down there and looked around and I realized that I couldn't do it. That anything that I did had to have a flat roof on it, you know. It had just gotten totally out of control, but very nicely so. I mean, in a very sort of a weird Gaudi way, you know. And here's up on the roof, and I think you can see what I mean about the sort of slightly surrealistic situation that evolved there. Then this is an adjacent project which happened several years later. They decided to build some little houses. So these, as you can see, I think from the site plan, about a similar sized area to the one that I had started with, and an adjoining piece of land. And